Apparently, there is a time-honored tradition of people finding out about Old Salem. 121 years after Tom, pictured here on this rock wall, became enlightened, we find ourselves yet again poised to learn about Salem. The child on the end looks pretty pleased to be there. He obviously doesn't know what's in store for him. As a brief overview, I'll say that the restoration of the Salem landscape began in 1973. Flora Ann Bynum was largely responsible for the process, and we have her to thank for much of the early research that formed the foundation of the program. The horticulture department maintains approximately 100 acres of property, including 10 cultivated spaces of varying sizes. Some areas are cultivated to display field crops. Others are what we refer to as family gardens, ones that are named for and associated with a family home, and a few are typical dooryard type gardens. The Single Brothers Garden is our largest cultivated space, and it was managed by the men who lived in the brothers' house to produce food for their use. In 1753, the Moravians arrived in present-day Forsyth County. Their purpose in coming was to establish a congregation town where their ideals of Christian living could be realized, and they could be of service to neighbors. They also wanted to establish a base from which to preach the gospel to the Native Americans. Wachovia is the name they gave to the approximately 100,000-acre tract of land they purchased, and the first town established was Bethabara. Salem was subsequently settled in 1766. Concern for providing food and other necessities of life in the wilderness led the Moravians to begin harnessing the natural resources for their use immediately upon their arrival in North Carolina. Forest areas were managed for the production of timber for building, tool creation, and other practical purposes. Ground was cleared for cultivation and sown with wheat within 3 weeks of their arrival. The gardens were planted not only with vegetables and herbs, but flowers as well. For the Moravians, creating order and beauty within their newfound wilderness home was also important. A visitor account, which appeared in a local newspaper of 1845, says, "The neat and order-like appearance of everything, and more than one beautiful sight attracted my attention. Its style and manners very city-like, and no place of the same size contains as many plants and flowers. In every window, yard, and garden you behold them, and some of very beautiful and rare order. If a great fancy for flowers argues a corresponding taste for all that's beautiful and lovely, then the people of Salem are unsurpassed." We owe much of our horticultural knowledge of Salem and its environs to accounts by 3 notable naturalists. Samuel Crampsch was a Moravian minister and botanist who compiled 3 floras during his time in Salem. His lists of the plants found growing in and around the area from 1789 to 1791 provide valuable information. Louis David von Schweinitz, who was a student of Crampsch, was also a Moravian minister and botanist. His extensive work classifying and identifying fungi has earned him the title of Father of American Mycology. His Flora Salementana was a result of his extensive exploration of the area within a 30-mile radius of Salem. He first identified the now endangered perennial sunflower, Helianthus schweinitzii, which Asa Gray and John Torrey subsequently named in his honor in 1842. Perhaps the most significant contribution to our program, however, comes from Christian Gottlieb Reuter. Reuter was a surveyor, naturalist, forester, and mapmaker. His contributions include what are likely the first American garden plans and associated plant lists. From him, we have plans for the first 2 gardens planted by the Moravians in North Carolina and a catalog of those cultivated species, along with extensive listings of both flora and fauna present in Wachovia during the 1760s. This body of work informs much of what we plant today. Reuter's instructions for creating herbal cures never cease to amuse me. He says, quote, "The best way to use flowers and herbs is to infuse them in rum, wine, beer, or in hot water like tea, and drink of them 2 or 3 times a day, and continue doing so for some weeks patiently." Unquote. Who's not going to feel better with that kind of cure? One way we strive to cultivate authentic plant material is to save seed from many of the varieties we grow. We agree with George Washington, who in a letter to his overseer writes, quote, "Herewith you will receive a parcel of seeds for the gardener. But I request you to tell him in positive terms that he must in future save his own seeds, for I cannot be eternally buying seeds in the manner I am, merely because it saves trouble, when the cost falls so heavily upon me, especially, too, as it is an equal chance that the seed is bad." Unquote. Since the 1980s, this department has worked harvesting our own seed stock to allow for accurate reproduction of the species. We currently save around 120 varieties of flowers and 75 vegetables. The resulting seed is used in the greenhouse by the greenhouse manager to propagate plants for use in the gardens and for sale in our plant sales area. We also list some of our more unique varieties in the Seed Savers Exchange yearbook and share some with the public during our annual seed swap hosted at Old Salem in conjunction with the local Slow Foods chapter.
Regardless of whether the garden is vegetable, flower, or herb, all of our gardens at Old Salem rely chiefly on compost made from tree leaves from the historic district, gathered in the fall and then combined with the green leaf garden waste, and turned once a season in the sun and then moved into the shade for the second year. The second year compost pile is what we amend our garden beds with. We grow vegetables in wide row raised beds amended with said aged leaf compost, occasionally some lime, and a complete organic fertilizer. In the mixed garden, Chet Tomlinson, portraying Matthew Mitch, who was trained as a gardener in Zeist, Holland, practices the French intensive market garden double digging technique. In the Single Brothers garden, I practice a modified approximate of this technique, substituting a broad fork for the spade, but otherwise similar intensive style. We practice integrated pest management, only using pesticides as a last resort, preferring to rely instead on flowers to attract beneficial insects and to establish a robust insect ecology that is resilient enough not to be overrun by any one pest. Herb flowers, buckwheat, clover, and various sunflowers are often in bloom in the Single Brothers garden, along with flowers of vegetables on their way to seed, like carrots or mustard. They all play a part in keeping our insect populations balanced. We're not sure all the ways that seeds have entered Salem, but what we do know helps us determine the most appropriate and specific varieties. We do know that in Salem's precursor town of Bethabara in 1758, they planted wheat from Zeist, supposed to be Italianischer, an Italian wheat. That next year, in 1759, in the Upland Garden, 6 years after the first 10 Moravian men migrated from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, to form Bethabara, there was a plot of seed brought personally from Germany, as depicted in Reuter's Upland Garden map. In this plot, at that particular time, of May 1759, they were growing seed of parsley, turnip-rooted parsley, onions, cabbage, red cabbage, beets, celery, chervil, corn salad, spinach, garlic, mangolds, cress, radish, cauliflower, nasturtium, kohlrabi, and marjoram. We don't know for sure if they grew seed in their gardens in other years, but they must have had some degree of success at producing seed in Bethabara, because in March of 1765, then Lieutenant Governor Tryon sent a young man to Bethabara to get, quote, all kinds of seeds for us for the plantation which Tryon wishes to lay out, unquote. The Moravians in Bethabara also had a medicinal garden, as mentioned earlier, depicted with plant lists in 1761. When the center of activity in Wachovia was transitioning from Bethabara to Salem in 1772, one sister took roots and plants from the medical garden to Bethabara to Salem. March 12th, 1772. Sister Bon and her little Jacob and the little girl Emerson went to Salem today, taking roots and plants from the medical garden here. In 1774, seedsman was listed as one of the professional tradesmen of Salem, so someone in Salem must have been producing seed for the growing community. Later, in 1808, we have a commercial correspondence of Brother Louis Benzian for Colonel Benjamin Hawkins, agent of Indian Affairs in the Creek Department, from John Jordan in Philadelphia. This is the earliest list that we have of kitchen garden seeds related to Salem in some way, with specific varieties named, though perhaps there is still something to be found in the Moravian archives. In 1823, in the diary of Susanna Cranch, there is a mention of gathering seeds of peas in July. In the 1830s, John Bloom imported seed from the most popular northern seedsman, specifically D. Landreth out of Philadelphia and an unnamed seedsman from Baltimore, and from the Shakers at Pleasant Hill in Kentucky. It also appears that Brother Bloom grew out his own seed, as noted in one seed ad in 1837 that was worded, "Fresh garden seeds, raised and put up by the subscriber, together with a variety of seeds received from Baltimore, for sale at this office." Other than those sources, which tell us much, but are still relatively scarce on specific varietal names, especially in the earlier Bethabara sources, our next step is glancing to the world outside of Wachovia to see what was typical of seed merchants during the 84 years of our interpretive window, from 1766 to 1850. In the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, there is, in the research files, a collection of over 50 seed ads from newspapers up and down the eastern U.S., spanning from 1751 to 1827. These ads supplement greatly our primary sources, with the names of vegetable varieties being brought over to the U.S. from Europe for sale, often from London. A compiled total of over 450 named varieties of kitchen garden seed are listed, giving us a sizable cross-section of typical period cultivated variety names. The slide here shows all the different garden pea varieties listed in those seed ads, 59 in all. These vegetable seeds brought over from Europe, as well as those from Africa and the Americas, were still most likely land races versus modern cultivated varieties. The best definition of landrace that I found is, quote, "a domesticated regional ecotype," unquote. The garden seeds that came over earlier were most likely landrace type populations of beet, cabbage, etc., adapted to their home region's environment and farming practices, yet still relatively very diverse genetically compared to our modern selections, therefore fairly adaptable to new environments. They didn't have very specific names except for where perhaps a single descriptor, like red cabbage, or a region, like Silesian lettuce. They were in the gradual process of becoming more modern cultivated varieties, parallel with a growing seed industry in Europe and in the United States. Noel Kingsbury, in his book Hybrid, The History and Science of Plant Breeding, has this quote, "Modern plant breeding, based on Mendelian genetics, is little more than a century old. In terms of time, the history of plant breeding has been the history of land races, but it is a history of which very little is recorded, and during which the processes of breeding have remained largely unchanged," unquote. As I've come to understand it, our interpretive time period from 1766 to 1850 spans a time of transition from landrace varietal experimentation in the U.S., where African, American, and European genetic food heritage is mixing and sifting into what became the American farm and kitchen garden. By the 1850s, at the very end of Old Salem's interpretive window, a new phase of seed varieties was beginning to emerge, populated by proto-modern varietals such as those being developed and offered by the Shakers in the first seed catalog in 1835. The seed industry would continue to become much more populated by seed companies. Mendelian understanding around the turn of the 20th century pushed the boundaries of plant breeding, giving us more consistent traits and yields. Old Salem's time period seems to be in the early dawn of what is now referred to as a golden age of open-pollinated vegetable varieties. Now called heirlooms, these vegetable varieties reached a peak just before pre-World War II, after which farmers and gardeners largely stopped growing them and saving their own seed with the advent of super yields of F1 hybrid technology. Thankfully, by the 1970s, some folks became aware of the need to preserve this seed heritage. Seed Savers Exchange was formed in 1975, a nationwide network of amateur seed stewards sharing open-pollinated seed. This is where we now source some of the harder to obtain seeds for the present day gardens at Old Salem. Rare heirloom kitchen garden varieties can be found in the Seed Savers Exchange annual yearbook, an almost phone book-like publication that in 2015 listed more than 12,000 varieties by around 700 seed savers. This network has been in operation for over 40 years now and has collectively been responsible for the continued existence of a large number of heirloom vegetables, grains, flowers, and herbs. A lot of our vegetable seed collection today is a result of the work of Bill Crow, a longtime gardener here at Old Salem. He sourced lots of period vegetable varieties from the Seed Savers Exchange Network and elsewhere in the 1990s and 2000s. He had an important to us collaboration with William Moyes Weaver. For over 10 years, Weaver would send rare heirloom seed from his Roughwood seed collection in Devon, Pennsylvania, to Bill to grow out in the gardens here. Bill would keep a little for our stock here and send the bulk back to Weaver every year. Over the span of that collaboration, these contributions from the Roughwood seed collection became a significant part of the Old Salem vegetable seed collection, contributing many early American, often Pennsylvania Dutch, heirlooms, as well as European and American landrace seeds. Some of the seed of varieties we seek are readily available commercially from seed companies like Southern Exposure, Seed Exchange, Seed Savers Exchange, and Baker Creek. For these things, we typically don't spend our time saving seed year to year and just purchase new seed every winter for that following year. This makes up perhaps 30% of what we grow. I've also been interviewing and collecting some seed from seed savers in our region who have generational seed grown here in the Piedmont and of North Carolina. This Seeds with Stories initiative gives us another perspective on what has been historically grown here in our region, and some of the seed is old enough that we feel okay about growing them in the gardens here.
Of the many flowers and herbs that I grow, I'll highlight a select group that appear on the Reuter list and that we propagate from seed, division, or cuttings. Scabiosa atropurpurea, morning bride or sweet scabiose, gets its Latin name from the word meaning itch, scabious. Soaking in a bath containing the leaves of this plant was once the only treatment for the skin disorder known as scabies. One reference suggested that the plant, quote, immigrated to New England with the infestation-fearing colonists, unquote. It's a great pollinator and butterfly plant. Comfrey, Symphytum officinale, has been used medicinally since ancient times. In the 19th century, Henry Doubleday famously invested much time and money into the experimental cultivation of comfrey by the ton for use as fodder and as a source of healthy food for the hungry. There is still testing going on with this plant, but there is now evidence showing it may have some carcinogenic properties. Fennel, Feniculum vulgare. This is not the Florence fennel grown for the bulbs. In this species, the seed and foliage are the part used in cooking and medicinally. During the Middle Ages, fennel was hung over the household door to keep the witches out. There's an adage suggesting you plant fennel near your kennel because it apparently has flea-repelling properties. It may repel fleas, but it's an excellent pollinator plant. There's always a cloud of tiny bees and wasps hovering over it, and the swallowtail caterpillars consume the foliage as well. European columbine, Aquilegia vulgaris, was considered an important part of the herbal pharmacopoeia in the 1760s. Salem gardeners are especially interested in this Aquilegia due to the mention it receives in William Moyes Weaver book, Sauer's Herbal Cures. It was apparently a rarity in the colonies during that time, but we have Reuters documentation indicating that the Moravians were growing it in Wachovia, presumably having brought seed with them from Europe. We have a sense of pride knowing that the Moravians were at the cutting edge of horticultural trends of the day. Schweinitz's sunflower, Helianthus schweinitzii, is on the list of federally endangered plants. This perennial sunflower is the one named in honor of the Salem minister and botanist who first identified the plant growing near present-day Charlotte. Its endangered status seems to be mostly due to habitat destruction. It would historically have been found on grassland or prairie sites or in forest openings. With the loss of these sites to development, it struggles to survive in the wild. We have a few small populations that we grow under the supervision of the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. Bellis perennis, English daisy, appears in Gerard's 16th century herbal, where he mentions the many medicinal properties of this plant. The leaves can also be used in salad or cooked. Chaucer describes the blooms as they open each morning as being, quote, the day's eye, unquote. I think they're really cute, and I enjoy seeing the blooms peeking up above the grass in the lawn areas. Larkspur, Consolida ajacis, is a beautiful spring ephemeral that recedes here in our gardens on its own. I love this color. Tansy, Tanacetum vulgare, is a medicinal herb used throughout history for various purposes, including cooking, though it contains thujone, which is toxic. It was also used for dyeing and to aid in preserving bodies for burial. It's also one of the strewing herbs. The foliage has a lovely clean scent, and the flower color is wonderful. Hop, or Humulus lupulus. This appeared in the earliest Moravian garden plans for Bethabara, and there they indicate a large area devoted entirely to the production of hops, so it was obviously important to them for some reason. The subsequent establishment of a brewery in Salem may give us a clue to this reason. The records also indicate that each home had a hop pole at the back door for the purposes of aiding yeast production in bread baking. We know that the Moravians cultivated roses here. The descendant specimens of a noisette type that was growing in 1823 at the Limeback House are in our gardens today. We also grow Rosa canina, the dog rose. You can see the gorgeous hips produced each fall. Cherokee rose, Rosa lavigata, is a strikingly beautiful species. I love the apple-like scent of the blooms. It also has wonderful hips. I read that during World War II, roses were planted in victory gardens so they could reap the benefits of the vitamin C. This is the eglantine rose, Rosa eglantaria. Our greenhouse manager cultivated this species for us from seed. It's famous for its apple-scented foliage.
Now I will highlight some of the interesting varieties of vegetables and field crops that we grow here in the gardens at Old Salem, and of course seed that we steward. I've given specific focus on those that have some kind of connection to the Moravian story or to the Piedmont, North Carolina region. The Charles Hubner rutabaga was likely one of the first rutabagas to come to the U.S. This rutabaga, or Swedish turnip as they were sometimes called, was brought to Broad Bay, Maine from Germany in 1752 by Moravian Charles Hubner. There was a short-lived Moravian community there in Broad Bay which dissolved, and many of the Broad Bay Mainers settled in Wachovia, North Carolina area. It's very possible that some of them brought seeds of this rutabaga with them, though we don't have positive confirmation of this. Maxitani garlic. William Moyes Weaver is our source of information and of plant stock for this hard-necked German red garlic variety. According to Weaver, in his Heirloom Vegetable Gardening book, the Maxitani garlic is a, quote, an extremely rare variety of German Rocambole that was brought to Pennsylvania by the Moravians in the 1740s. It originated in Silesia in what is now western Poland and was preserved by the Helfrich family for homeopathic medicines. The bulbs are bronze in color, unquote. He says that the flavor is robust and that the Pennsylvania Dutch use the leaves in the fall and spring sprouts in cabbage salads. We sometimes renew our stock of Maxitani by planting the little bulbils that form at the tip of the garlic plant. Bessler's cherry pepper. Bessler's cherry pepper is called that because Bacillus Bessler is one of the earliest to illustrate it in one of his botanical books. The strain that we have grown here in Old Salem came from William Moyes Weaver, and in his book, Heirloom Vegetable Gardening, he talks about his stock, saying, quote, the strain of Bessler's cherry pepper that I am growing descends from the seed acquired in the 1860s by the Gompf family of Lidditz in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The Gompfs were Moravians and maintained a kitchen garden stocked with vegetables gathered from exotic places by Moravian missionaries. In this case, the peppers came from eastern Nicaragua, unquote. We grow a few other peppers in the gardens, including the Hinkelhotz pepper. According to Weaver, the Hinkelhotz pepper has been cultivated by the Pennsylvania Dutch for well over 170 years. The Pennsylvania Dutch name means chicken heart, and that is indeed what it looks like. We also grow the cayenne pepper, the bullnose pepper, the fish pepper, goat horn peppers, Willings Barbados pepper, and McMahon's Texas bird pepper. Schutt's icicle cucumbers. Seed of this Forsyth County heirloom was given to us by siblings Dorothy and Walter Craver. Used in their family for making icicle pickles, these cukes produce both green and white fruit. Dorothy and Walter traced this family heirloom back to around 1875 with their great uncle Schutt, who was the original known steward of this cucumber. Stone mustard. Sent via mail from Marty Hedrick of High Point, North Carolina. This hardy family heirloom was named by Marty's grandmother Yoakley, who gave the seeds the name Stone Mustard, after Ora Minnie Lou Stone. The family story is that this mustard traces back with their family roots to David Yoakley, who came to the U.S. from Germany and brought this mustard seed with him, sometime in his lifetime from 1786 to 1873. I've grown it out once for seed, so I've only nibbled the leaves right in the garden, but the taste of the greens were quite palatable to my taste. White and black seeded half-runner beans. We've been given two different strains of the white seeded half-runners, one family heirloom from the Salisbury area and another from Stanley County. The Stanley County fir family heirloom strain story is that it's been in the family since somewhere between 1835 and 1865. White seeded half-runners seem to be the most common old-timey bean in these parts. I hazily remember my grandmother growing them. Harvey Moser, a local farmer, tells me that in Stokes County, where he's from, many folks grow the white-seeded half-runners, but even more rare is the black-seeded half-runner. According to Harvey, in Stokes, if you vote Republican, you grow the white-seeded half-runners, and if you vote Democrat, you go the black-seeded bean. Needless to say, Harvey hasn't found anyone yet who has grown the black-seeded half-runners to share with him. Perhaps black-seeded half-runners need a reintroduction to the North Carolina Piedmont. Pole beans, more beans. Beans were a favorite of seed savers everywhere, probably because they were easy to save due to their self-pollinating abilities. We have many beans on our shelves. Somewhere around 55 different types of pole and bush beans sit on those shelves, partially due to Bill Crow's growing them out for William Moyes Weaver and to Bill's steadfastness at finding bean varieties from our time period. The result is that at this point we have lots of beans near the point of losing their viability. So again, we've had to focus, pick, and choose. Going for rare, southern, and American Indian varieties seems to be the consensus among us vegetable gardeners. One that gardener Greg grows is brown-seeded lazy wife pole bean. Supposedly it's easier to pick because the beans grow in clusters. He also grows the Mohawk bush bean, which is fairly rare and only now listed by one seed saver in the yearbook. This old-timey bean can be seen in a few old seed ads. He also stewards a few other pole beans and bush types. Recently, I've grown the Palatine tiger bean, also known as white Dutch, not to be confused with the Palatine case knife bean. And then also the Schmitz family heirloom from West Virginia area, supposedly found in an old barn of a 1750s German settlement there. Cowpeas. Cowpeas are a staple crop in the hot and humid southern summer. The cowpea's African heritage suits them to our part of the U.S., providing a useful nitrogen-fixing leguminous cover crop. Shown here are the cowpea roots with nodules of rhizobia and the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Cowpeas also give us fresh green pea pods and dry storage peas. Whippoorwill is a southern standard heirloom cowpea. I've seen several different strains. Mike Trivett in Iredell County keeps one strain that may be blue goose, depending on who you talk to. Our strain came from Weaver and is of a smaller pea size compared to the Crowder type pea, which are a fair bit larger. We do have a strain of Crowders that has the same blue speckled mottling characteristic of Whippoorwill. Another family heirloom strain of cowpea was donated to Old Salem this year by the daughter of a man from Tarboro, North Carolina, a little east of Raleigh. They are either creamer peas or rice peas. They were given to us as the name Lady Cream pea, and also they were called Josiah Vick pea. The peas look identical to the rice cowpea to my eyes. Tiny cream-colored peas, they are often regarded as among the best tasting, and though that taste comes at the price of shelling such a tiny pea, taste tests should ensue to tell the difference. Also, a comparison of growth habit would be the next step in comparing these two heritage cowpea varieties. Jarvis corn. Plowboy Jarvis's golden prolific corn is probably Forsyth County's most well-known heirloom. Bred, grown, and seed stock sold by Forsyth County native Plowboy Jarvis himself. Plowboy Jarvis's golden prolific was once a popular corn variety in the 1920s and 30s until the green hybrid revolution. It was even a USDA recommended variety for parts of the southeast. These days, at least a couple farmers in our area have taken to growing this corn. One of them, Carl Gunn, thinks this corn is significant because of the tightness of the husk. It seems to keep pests out of the kernels. Glenn Roberts of Anson Mills is also familiar with this corn, and they are currently doing their own research for a possible grow-out focus in 2016. He says they have information that leads them to believe it's actually an older Moravian strain of corn predating Plowboy. I look forward to delving deeper into this at some time. Perhaps one day we will have more info fitting this corn into Old Salem's interpretive time period, and we can grow Jarvis corn in our gardens here. Glenn Roberts also says that Jarvis corn makes the best parched corn he's ever tasted. This is a corn primed for a comeback. Gordsey corn and John Hawk are two other corn varieties that fit into our time period and region. Purple straw wheat. I was searching for an appropriate heritage wheat to grow in the vault slot here at Old Salem a few years ago. Scanning through the wheat listings of the Seed Savers Exchange yearbook, I found Tevis of Crabapple Farm in Massachusetts. He was offering various old wheat varieties to sell by the pound. I wrote him inquiring about Gold Coin, a fairly old wheat variety that he had listed, explaining my situation of wanting a pre-1850 wheat variety to grow in the gardens at Old Salem. He wrote back offering purple straw, variously known as mountain blue stem, early purple straw, mountain blue stem, and blue stem, of which he had some extra. Apparently, Winston-Salem was in the center of purple straw's geographic distribution, according to J. Allen Clark's 1922 USDA survey classification of American wheat varieties. J. Allen Clark also mentions that purple straw was once known to date back to at least 1820, so that safely put it into our time period. Tevis sent me 5 pounds of purple straw, along with 5 pounds of red May, the other remaining colonial-era wheat variety, and planted the Volts field in the two. The wheat had no problems except for lodging, growing too tall, which I've since learned I made the common mistake of fertilizing the soil before planting the wheat. Apparently, these old landrace grains grow better in a low-fertility environment. So this year, I'm growing the seed saved from the 2013 grow-out sans fertilizer. Since that initial grow-out, coincidentally, purple straw has undergone a resurgence that is still in progress. New research has been uncovered showing purple straw to go back much further than the 1820s, back to the beginning of the colonial America. This year, it was boarded onto the Slow Food Ark of Taste. Also, David Shields, Glenn Roberts, and David Ward, all in South Carolina, are growing out seed stock this winter at the Organic Research Farm at Clemson's Coastal Research and Education Center in Charleston, with the aims of reintroducing purple straw into the food and drink culture, enticing craft distillers with the opportunity to use one of the two varieties used in Old Tennessee whiskey. Ozette potato. The Ozette was brought by the Spanish from Peru to Washington State in the late 1700s. The Indians in that area eventually adopted it, but in recent years it became very scarce. Bill Crow started growing it here in our gardens because it was one of the few remaining potatoes that date back to our time period and was quite rare, though most likely never made it to the East Coast before 1850. But it was worth growing in our gardens to preserve this rare potato. We now grow cups, garnet chili, yam, lumper, and hopefully soon a restored old variety peach blow via the Kenosha Potato Project. Squash. Squashes. This is how Christian Reuter listed squash in his original inventory of the Wachovia tract. We don't know what type of squash the Moravians were growing in Wachovia, but we do know that early on they tried to grow them in the Three Sisters or milpa fashion. April 3rd, 1753, today we planted corn with pumpkins and beans between, unquote. The two squashes that I've most recently grown in the gardens are both Indian squashes, and neither from right here in our region. The Seminole squash is a small winter pumpkin, originally from the Florida area and grown by the Seminole Indians. Apparently, they used to girdle trees and plant the squash at the base of these trees. When the Europeans first saw the squash vines covering these trees with the small pumpkins hanging off, they thought they had come across squash trees. We grow the squash because of its southern province and the fact that it's virtually bulletproof. The vines root in as they go, helping to ensure against death by vine borer. They also have a decent resistance to powdery mildew. The fruit stores nicely as well, often lasting through the winter well into next spring. The Mquanna squash comes to us via the Menominee Indians of Wisconsin region. This isn't a squash of southern provenance by any means, yet it found its way into our gardens for similar reasons as the Ozette potato. In 2010, I was sorting through our squash seed collection, looking to find what was most in need of being grown out. What seed was in danger of losing viability? Which seeds were hardest to find? The Mquanna seed on our shelf was at least 10 years old, nearing the end of its room temperature stored viability. I searched through the Seed Savers Exchange yearbook. No listing in 2010. I started searching back through previous yearbooks. In 2004 was the last year that had been listed in a yearbook. Apparently it got a bad rap for the outer shell being, quote, so hard I had to use an axe to splint them open, unquote. Amongst all of the other most likely more palatable and agreeable heirloom squashes to steward, Mquanna had seemed to be neglected. Searching the internet brought no results. The squash almost seemed not to exist, except for it did in seed form on our shelves. So I grew it out, seeding heavily, assuming low germination. Lots did germinate, and I was able to get a seed crop of this old landrace squash, reviving its viability for at least perhaps 10 years more. I was surprised at the variability of the fruit. Blue, green, white, orange, yellow, stripes, solid, warts, and all. The squash has a diversity that I find fascinating, and it seems important to keep this diversity alive and to share it. I've since listed the seed in the Seed Savers Exchange yearbook and given lots away to folks through our annual seed swap and to farmer friends of mine. Sorghum. Sorghum is quite the utilitarian plant. Thriving in our hot and humid summers here in the southeast is no problem, and it's not too bothered by a long dry spell either. Here's a photo of sorghum growing in companion with cowpeas, two parts of the African complementary style, or two sisters, or milpa. Michael Twitty mentioned this growing style a few years ago while advising us on the Homo Wild Harvest seed collection and potential African-American gardens at Old Salem. Sorghum was referred to as Negro corn in Reuter's accounts of Wachovia. Black amber cane is supposedly one of the oldest varieties still around from colonial times. We've also grown the Mennonite sorghum. Broom corn is a staple in the Single Brothers garden each year as we grow it for the education department. Each year they harvest and dry the broom corn for brooms. They say we grow them about $1,000 worth of broom corn if they were to buy it online. The last year I grew red-seeded, black-seeded, and rainbow broom corn, all from Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. So, as you can see, our department strives to uphold the historic integrity of our landscapes through good stewardship of heirloom plant material. Maintaining these species not only provides us with the resources to do our job here, but helps sustain diversity at a time when it's desperately needed.